Now Trump has kind of gone, really, put his foot on the pedal. China has hit back, which shows that they're trying to kind of say, we can go head for head here, and that this is a mutually assured destruction doom loop. And so certainly the combination of both the US and China hitting these tariffs is a pretty nuclear one. And that's why we're seeing these really catastrophic falls on the stock market all around the world.
Now we're going to discuss the big foreign and diplomatic stories. There is a lot going on. It's almost exclusively because of the actions of the United States President Donald Trump. Joining me now is Sophia Gaston. She works for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute think tank, as well as being a visiting fellow at King's College London. And she's just come back from Washington. Welcome to the show, Sophia.
Thanks for having me.
How was Washington?
I mean, it's quite surreal. There's a lot of people just sort of paralyzed in a state of inertia. And then there are others who sort of have a cowboyish glee. There's a real revolutionary zeal gripping the city. But most people are just in a state of shock or extreme caution, just waiting for things to settle and watching how things play out.
Yes, it reminds me of the Brexit fervour after the referendum. Now, trying to put a sort of gloss, an optimistic gloss on this, there's this talk that sort of 50 countries have rung the White House tariff hotline. I mean, is there a possibility that some kind of weird ad hoc global trade talks will emerge out of this debacle?
I think that's extremely unlikely. The one thing we really know about Trump is that he is hostile towards international institutions and bureaucracy. He wants everything done on a bilateral basis. I think with those numbers, the White House feels that they're in a very good position. I mean, for President Trump, he now has 50 different countries that need to sort of kiss the ring and make their case. And I think what's really extraordinary is just seeing, speaking with other capitals, I'm just hearing how much work's going on to try and draw up attractive packages that can be offered to the president in order to negotiate those tariffs down. So that's exactly where President Trump wants everyone to be.
Let's look at some sort of 3 or 4 countries that are relevant. Let's start with us for a start. The British have this habit of looking on this idea of a sort of UK-US trade deal as being somehow the gold at the end of the rainbow. It's almost there. I think Kemi Badenoch was on the television, the Tory leader, over the weekend, because obviously when she was a minister, the Conservative government was negotiating, saying it'd been sort of through 6 iterations and it was just, almost there. I mean, it still remains really a fantasy. And to paraphrase Barack Obama, we're still at the back of the queue, aren't we?
No, certainly not. It's not a fantasy, and we're not at the back of the queue by any means. In fact, Britain is at the front of the queue. I can't overstate how much, it is true. Britain's stock is high in Washington. It sort of goes both ways. I mean, there's a lot of scrutiny on the UK, particularly our sort of social and political dynamics. I heard a lot of people just sort of casually mentioning this idea that people are being sort of arrested off the street in the UK and so on. But that same kind of intent concern is driven by this idea of Britain as the kind of birthplace of Western civilization as they see it. So there's a kind of fondness and affection for Britain. It means that we are scrutinized more, but it does also mean that there is a kind of fundamental openness to thinking about the UK as an ally in a way that certainly some of our other friends in Europe are not afforded that same kind of luxury. So I think certainly there is a genuine prospect of the UK being able to negotiate on some of these tariffs and sort of thrashing out a bit of maybe a hodgepodge architecture of some kind of trade agreement, particularly focusing around tech cooperation, which could help get those numbers down overall. And I also think it's important to emphasize that there are sort of other elements of the relationship where the UK is seen to be able to add value. I mean, particularly on advanced tech, this is, the strategic competition around this is absolutely front and center for the new administration in the US. So I think we have things to add to their strategic mission, as well as just that question about the bilateral trade relationship.
Well, I wasn't expecting you to say that at all, and that is absolutely fascinating. So it is true that Keir Starmer, despite being a sort of left-wing prime minister and therefore in some ways very out of step with this administration, that the UK remains very much a focus for Washington and a favoured friend.
Yes, I mean, I don't think any ally is really a focus per se, but certainly, everything is through the lens of American self-interest. But with regards to allies, I mean, there has been a fundamental shift and a real narrowing of the purview of who's in that tent. There's really only 4 countries that kind of fundamentally matter to President Trump, and it's Britain, Australia, Japan, and India. And everybody else is sort of, there can be affection and favor towards them or particular leaders. But these are the 4 countries where there's a mix of affection and also a sort of sense that there can be a viable strategic partnership. So we're very fortunate to be in that little gang. But it's also true that that confers a pretty significant responsibility for us to actually make the most of that. Because if we can demonstrate value to the US through this alliance, then that is going to make the US much more inclined to pursue allied relationships with other friends of ours too. So I think really just the pressure is on the Starmer government to actually act on this privileged position that we have. And I think, it's such an unusual way for us to think about alliances in such a deeply transactional way. But I think, we need to keep level heads, but we have to just think in a much more kind of mercantilist and tactical way about what we have to offer.
That is really interesting, and maybe we've spawned a new acronym. It could be BAGI for Britain, America, Japan, and India, or BEIGE even. We could be the Beige Alliance. And there is a serious point underlining that, because that is a really interesting kind of take on who, as it were, can get the ear of Washington. And you obviously mentioned Australia. You're with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Australia's going through elections at the moment. I was thinking as you were talking that we are all in the weird position where we should be carrying a sort of laminated card with all the tariffs that Washington has imposed, so we can recall them immediately. I think Australia's got off relatively lightly, apart from the penguins. But obviously, one of the big achievements of the Biden-Sunak government was the AUKUS Defence Alliance, where the US stepped in, replaced France as the builder of Australian submarines. Presumably, on your thesis, all of that is kind of tickety-boo at the moment.
Well, I wouldn't say tickety-boo. I would say that there's a lot of work being done in Australia to think about how they sell their story to the US. I mean, they've got an advantage in that they're essentially cutting pretty big checks as part of AUKUS. So they're actually paying to upgrade America's submarine industrial base. So they're giving literally billions to the US, and they rather cannily showed up on sort of day one of the Trump presidency with an enormous check to hand.
Elon Musk style oversized check.
Yeah, like a sort of game show. But that went down very well, actually. But I do think, the UK actually on AUKUS, I think might be in an even better position for a couple of reasons. I think one, the pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is really about a tech accelerator program. This is where we're kind of collaborating on tech projects to try and be able to compete more effectively against China, which has sort of taken the lead in some of these key areas. The UK is seen by the US to be the kind of only real viable partner for that kind of advanced tech cooperation. So we're actually in quite a good position there if we can really sell ourselves and think about the infrastructure that we'll need to actually deliver on that. The other thing is that we've got Sir Stephen Lovegrove, who of course was the National Security Advisor when AUKUS was announced. He's been conducting this big AUKUS review, and that's going to really sort of enact a kind of reset of the project. And that's exactly the kind of language that the Trump administration is interested in. They want dynamism and agility and everything kind of adapted to the primacy of American self-interest. So I think we're actually in an okay place from the UK side on that. And Australia, even though they're being sort of less I suppose they're less encouraged by the idea of sort of a reset there. They're trying to just stay the course, but they are, putting some pretty big money on the table. So I think hopefully the combination of that will be a winner.
And obviously, you keep referencing sort of the tech alliances, Britain's role in helping America with tech, and now Australia's role as well. And obviously, the one country that can't be part of our beige alliance is China. The US, both administrations have taken on China in terms of general trade policy. But of course, there is this massive strategic tech fight for tech dominance as well. China has really been the first to the table with the retaliatory tariffs, the huge tariffs imposed by the US effectively being matched by China. That is the heart, really, of where things could go very wrong for the global economy, isn't it?
Well, certainly, I think once China retaliated, we knew that we were really in trade war territory. And, I think it was interesting because both the US and China have been quite sort of feeling each other out since Trump came into power. And there's been a little bit ambiguity about where President Trump is going to go on China. Let's not forget that in his first term, he did actually seek to pursue a deal with President Xi, a trade deal. That all sort of fell apart, and he ended that administration in a much more combative position towards China, and actually sort of precipitated this broader shift that we've all gone on in the West to understanding the security dimensions of our relationship with China. I think it's not unlikely that we will have a similar sort of scenario in this second Trump term. He has made no secret of the fact that he would ultimately like to tackle this fundamental trade deficit that the US has with China. I think the thing that's really worrying China watchers is the question about what he'd be willing to trade to do that. But certainly in the first few weeks, with those kind of initial tariffs he announced on China, and China's response to that, you could see that both sides were actually exercising a bit of caution. Now Trump has kind of gone, really, put his foot on the pedal. China has hit back, which shows that they're trying to kind of say, we can go head for head here, and that this is a mutually assured destruction doom loop. And so certainly the combination of both the US and China hitting these tariffs is a pretty nuclear one. And that's why we're seeing these really catastrophic falls on the stock market all around the world. What's really interesting is the question about where China goes with its neighbors. I think there are some in the China watching community, again, who are a bit concerned about the impact that Trump's tariffs will have on Asian economies. There's been a big contest in the Indo-Pacific between the US and China for these kind of really vital, fast-growing, economically valuable trade relations. And it's been a sort of head-to-head. But now the US has moved first and slapped really significant tariffs on a lot of Asian economies.
Yeah, Vietnam has got 49%, Cambodia, of course, 49%. Singapore's only got 10%, I think, but 3 or 4 of the big ASEAN economies have been hit with super tariffs.
Yes, and we would expect that China will want to make the most of that and make further inroads and deepen those relationships. And in the long term, that's actually not going to be good for America's strategic influence on that region. So we'll see where it goes. But I think China has typically been quite good at holding its nerve, watching how things play out, watching where the West makes calamitous errors, and then reaping all the rewards.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, because obviously countries like Vietnam and so on benefited hugely from the sort of first trade war, because a lot of Chinese companies moved their manufacturing to places like Vietnam in order to avoid the tariffs aimed directly at China. But also, obviously, a lot of American companies that didn't want to be exposed to the US policy towards China also placed their manufacturing in these ASEAN countries. And that's going to be a big problem. And it's also very interesting what you say about, how China will play this. I was fascinated. There was actually a very interesting post on LinkedIn, dare I say. It's a bit of a giveaway to say you look at LinkedIn, by James Cleverly, the former foreign secretary, saying that, when he went to China as foreign secretary and lectured them on human rights, he expected to have a sort of stand-up round. Instead, the Chinese foreign minister was very emollient and talked about how the UK and China could work more closely together. And we saw this with Trump 1 as well, with Xi at Davos. I mean, China will take massive advantage of this.
Yes, and I think it's extremely dangerous. I think just, on your point regarding Vietnam, that's actually part of the reason why Trump has levied these extremely high tariffs on Southeast Asia, because in his view, he's actually creating a stick to say, you've actually taken on board a lot of Chinese supply chains and manufacturing responsibility, which has actually kind of bailed out a lot of Chinese firms and softened the impact of that competition with America. So he thinks that's a stick from which you can actually coerce Vietnam back to the table and to sort of divest from those supply chains. Whether or not that actually plays out in practice, that's to be seen. But I think on your broader question, I absolutely agree. One thing that really has concerned me has just been seeing in Europe and in Britain, of course, as well, these questions starting to be raised about, well, if America is being very transactional towards its allies, maybe we should be more transactional towards China, which means perhaps rolling back some of our kind of security posture and being more open to trade and investment and engagement with China. We should be under no illusions that, China is fundamentally an authoritarian state, which is seeking to dismantle the international order, which has so profoundly served our interests. So getting economically entangled and becoming dependent on China is only going to ultimately, in the medium term, decrease our sovereignty and geopolitical optionality. So I've been very concerned about those developments. And I think that's partly why it's going to be very, very important for Britain to work with our allies in Europe and Indo-Pacific as well, just to sort of make sure that we can actually remain competitive and resilient when you don't have the United States driving allied cooperation.
Absolutely. Well, Sophia Gaston, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking us through the impact of Trump's tariffs in terms of the geopolitics of the globe. Sophia Gaston, who works with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute think tank, as well as being a visiting fellow at King's College London.